Hi, it's Mr. Ramage, and we are going to start some lessons on the beginning of the Cold War. And the Cold War is a huge part of American and world history, and it's going to last for a really long time. And this video lesson is going to kind of dive into the beginnings of it and provide you with an understanding of how the whole thing started. And to guide us through this lesson, I'm going to be utilizing the standard from the state of Ohio for American history, which states that the United States followed a policy of containment during the Cold War in response to the spread of communism. So this lesson's going to be not a deep dive, but it is going to cover a lot of content. These are the topics that we're going to go through in this lesson as we look at the origins of the Cold War and focusing on that term containment. And we want to look for examples of containment as we go forward. So to understand the beginnings of the Cold War, we do need to provide some context and some background information, and this will be really brief. We do need to know where the Soviet Union came from, and that followed the 1917 Russian Revolution and the Civil War that broke out, and that by 1922 we now have the world's first communist nation, led by Vladimir Lenin. And eventually, over the course of a couple of years following Lenin's death, we have Joseph Stalin, who emerges as the leader of the Soviet Union. As we get into World War II, again, a lot of context to provide here, but very, very briefly, the Soviet Union is going to begin the war allied or with a non-aggression pact with Germany. And then eventually, after Germany's invasion of Russia, we're going to have the Russian army driving the Germans back from the east, back towards Germany and back towards the city of Berlin. As the Russian army moves across Europe on its way to Germany, they are going to seize control of the nations of Eastern Europe. And after the war is over, they're going to install pro-Soviet, pro-communist governments, and they are going to occupy these countries. More on that here in a little bit. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, we have the British and the Americans moving into Germany from the west, supported by French troops as well. And this is where the war kind of comes to an end. The Russians are going to occupy the eastern portion of Germany, while the other allies, America, England, and France, will occupy the western section of Germany. And not only are they going to divide Germany into an eastern and western sector, each country gets its own sector, but we're going to see that the British, French, and Americans are going to work more closely together. They also determined that the capital city of Berlin should also be divided along the same kind of lines, right? Where the Russians will occupy the eastern portion of Berlin, while the British, the French, and the Americans each maintain control of a sector of the western portion of Berlin. So Berlin mirrors the nation of Germany. The eastern half will be occupied by communist forces, while the western half will be occupied by American, British, and French forces. And Germany really does become sort of ground zero for the Cold War, and even more so, Berlin becomes ground zero. And what's interesting, if you can read the map here and understand where we're going, we're going to have a democratic Western Berlin smack dab in the middle of what will eventually become a communist nation. So probably not the best of ideas here, but we can definitely understand why the Americans and the British and the French want to hold on to Berlin as the capital city. It's kind of vital that they have some influence and control over that. They don't want the capital to be completely swallowed by a communist nation. So as the World War ends, we're beginning to see evidence and some problems moving forward, right? This is probably not the safest of situations. Even though we have been allied with the Russians, we don't like them. They don't like us. We don't want them to spread their political and economic ideologies any further, and nor do they want the United States to expand its own ideologies any further. And the Cold War becomes essentially a battle over these ideologies. The United States wants to stop the spread of communism. We've already seen it spreading through Eastern Europe at the end of the war. The United States wants to put an end to this. Communism is in opposition to our ideologies, while the communists want to do kind of the same thing, protect itself from America and capitalism, to create a boundary and a border to protect and isolate itself, but also to spread to other countries. And this all will eventually get us to a Cold War. Now, in a Cold War, there is no direct fighting between the two nations who are in opposition to each other. The United States is not going to go to war with the Soviet Union. There's no direct fighting between these two nations because that would result in a world war, or what would be even more terrifying, some form of nuclear war, where both sides, who will eventually possess nuclear weapons — the United States already has theirs in 1945, the Russians will get theirs in 1949. If we are going to come into direct conflict with each other, that could result in what's known as mutually assured destruction. That at some point, we are going to have the capability to completely destroy the Soviet Union and its allies, and they will also have the nuclear capability to do the same thing. And nobody wants that. So the Cold War will be a very, very, very dangerous time for the rest of the world. Let's come back to these countries from Eastern Europe. As the Russian army moved towards Germany, again, I said it occupied and controlled these countries, establishing pro-communist, pro-Soviet governments. These countries will become known as satellite nations, with the objective being that they create a buffer between the western portion of Europe in blue and protecting, essentially, acting as a buffer between them and the rest of Europe, so that the Soviet Union will be protected, its border will be protected. It's already been invaded by Germany twice, in World War I and in World War II, and these countries will be essentially under Soviet control and will be run as puppet nations or puppet states. Another term that's commonly used when we talk about the Cold War is the term the Iron Curtain. And this was coined by the former Prime Minister of England, Winston Churchill, at a speech he gives in the United States. And he describes the divide now that exists in Europe between the communist sphere and the democratic sphere, where we now have this symbol, this idea of this Iron Curtain that's descended across Europe, that you can't penetrate, that we can't go there, and they won't allow people to leave. And that term pops up a lot when you study the Cold War. And it's a good visualization as we see now emerging in this post-war world a communist Eastern Europe dominated by the Soviet Union, dominated by Russia, and a democratic Western Europe that will be dominated by the United States and England primarily. So we've got East versus West. So in terms of the approach the United States is going to take to the spread of communism, we can't really do anything about where it is right now because, like we talked about a moment ago, that would result in some type of war, either potentially another world war or some form of nuclear war. So the policy of containment is going to be developed by the U.S. ambassador to Russia, a guy by the name of George Kennan, who spent many years in Russia, knows the language, knows the people, knows the culture. And President Truman asks him, basically, as sort of the expert on Russia, what should we do? What are your suggestions? And he writes this long letter to the president, which is what it's called. And in that long letter, he says, what we need to do is have, quote, a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. So this is Kennan's suggestion to the president, that we need to develop a policy of containment, that we have to be patient, we have to be firm, we have to be vigilant. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. This is not something that's going to end very quickly, but rather maybe a few decades down the road. That we need to keep communism where it is, we need to not let it spread any further, and then basically just wait. Kennan does not believe communism can survive, that the system is ineffective and that it's already not working. So his perspective is it's going to fail, and he was right. That what we needed to do was just be patient, wait for communism to basically defeat itself, and avoid at all cost any direct conflict with the Russians. Because at some point, he says they're probably not going to back down, and we don't want to get into that kind of game with the Russians. Because any kind of direct conflict, again, leads to nuclear war. So it's really important moving forward that we understand this policy of containment. Okay, a long-term, patient, firm, vigilant policy against the Soviet Union where we do not let communism spread. So we will succeed at containment if we keep communism from spreading. We will fail at containment if communism spreads to other nations. So that's going to kind of be our gauge for, are we actually pulling this off? And there will be almost some immediate challenges to this new policy of containment. So let's look at a couple of examples of containment that we're going to see in action. The first one is the Truman Doctrine. So again, long story short, there are some communist uprisings and the threat of the nations of Greece and Turkey potentially falling to Russian-supported pro-communist forces. And we're not going to get into the whole story of it, but essentially, we were worried that Greece and Turkey might develop a pro-Soviet, pro-communist government, and we want to stop that. Again, containment, right? So we need to make sure that Greece and Turkey remain free of communist control. So President Truman sends $400 million over to Greece and to Turkey to help them fight off these communist revolutions. Truman said, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way." And he doesn't say Soviet Union, he doesn't say communism, but he does say that with some other language. Okay, so that's another cool part of the Cold War is how we talked about the Russians and how they talked about us without really putting our names out there. So the Truman Doctrine works, right? It's a policy of containment. We need to keep communism from spreading to Greece and Turkey. Truman sends $400 million. With those funds and resources, the Greeks and the Turks are able to put down these communist uprisings and remain free nations. So that's good, right? So put a check in the win column for the United States and for containment. Another example of containment is the Marshall Plan, which was devised and created by the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall. And as the Secretary of State, he's very well aware of the conditions in Europe after World War II. Western Europe had been decimated. France especially, Western Germany especially, England. These countries are in ruins. These countries have lost their infrastructure. They've lost cities. They've lost everything, right? So what we need to do is to rebuild. If the United States leaves Western Europe in the condition that it is in, Marshall says it will fall to the communists. It will only be a matter of time. So what we need to do is to rebuild Western Europe. The best way to protect the United States, the best way to institute containment, the best way to keep communism from spreading to Western Europe is to help rebuild. That to stabilize Western Europe will create a strong Europe that can defend itself from the spread of communism. So the U.S. commits to the Marshall Plan, sending over $15 billion in aid, one of the greatest humanitarian programs in world history. Again, the United States is doing it to benefit itself, but it will also benefit millions and millions and millions of people. And with American dollars heavily invested in Western Europe, we're going to rebuild Western Europe. Now, the Marshall Plan did make offers to those countries in the Soviet Union and under Soviet control, and none of those countries accepted our funds. You can see here in the map the nations that received the most funds with the blue lines. Obviously, England and France are going to receive the majority of these funds, but money is going to go all over the place to shore up and to help rebuild these people in Western Europe. That gets us to the first kind of crisis that we're going to see here in the Cold War. So containment so far has worked. We've got the Truman Doctrine, we've got the Marshall Plan. Well, now we're really going to put it to the test in what's known as the Blockade of Berlin. So if we go back to Berlin, it is the capital of Germany, and it is located within the Soviet-occupied territory. Now, Berlin as a city was being administered by a joint government, which was made up of the Russians, the British, the Americans, and eventually the French, called the Kommandatura. Okay, so this body, this governing body, was in charge of administering both Eastern Berlin and Western Berlin. So in 1947, England, the United States, and eventually France are going to make a choice that's going to sort of set the stage for the beginning of this Berlin blockade. It involves the currency that was being used in Germany, which was the Reichsmark. So the British, the Americans, the French are going to combine their sector's currency to kind of stabilize it, right? Again, we're not going to get into the economics of this, but basically what we need to know is that the Deutschmark, the new currency that's going to be created by the British and the American and the Frenches in their sector, known as Bizonia, and then eventually Trizonia when the French enter, will now be using a new currency in their sectors called the Deutschmark. The Soviets see this as a direct threat to their economic system in Eastern Germany, which still uses the Reichsmark. That this will devalue it will make it worthless, and that the economies of the western portion of Germany will come to dominate the economy of the eastern portion of Germany, which is under the Russian control. And they're right, it's exactly what that's going to do. So in response to this, the Russians are going to leave the Kommandatura, and then Stalin is going to announce in June of 1948 that that we are going to blockade Western Berlin. So this is Stalin's attempt to take control of Western Berlin. He's not attacking anybody. He's not declaring war on anybody. Again, we have to play the Cold War game. He is creating a blockade of Western Berlin, closing off all the roads, railroad lines, water lines, electricity, gas, all the stuff. He's essentially putting Western Berlin on lockdown, creating a blockade around it, with the objective of basically starving the city out. That West Berlin would eventually fall. The Russians would take control of West Berlin. It would be then rejoined with Eastern Berlin, and it would just be Berlin within the Soviet sector, and then the Russians would have sole control of the capital of Germany. You can see that illustrated here in this political cartoon. We have this road to Berlin. So during the negotiations, there was a road that was kept open between the western portion of Germany and the city of West Berlin. And that is where the citizens of West Berlin received their supplies, their materials, their resources. Essentially, by cutting off West Berlin from the western section of Germany, we are going to basically starve those people out, cut them off from anything that they need to survive. Another great political cartoon here showing the Russian bear with his arms and his bloody claws wrapping itself around the city of Berlin, illustrating the blockade. So, with the city of West Berlin cut off from its supplies, what is the United States going to do? Well, what can they do is probably the first question. Not what will they do, but what can they do? Can they attack the blockade? Well, they can't really do that, because if they attack the blockade, that's going to trigger a war, and we have no idea where that's going to get us, right? So we definitely want to avoid that. We can't let the blockade stand, because if the blockade does stand, then West Berlin's going to fall to the communists, and containment will have failed. Remember that word containment. We need to contain communism. If communism takes control of West Berlin, then containment has failed. We have failed, that we have lost to the communists. President Truman says we're going to stay, period. We are not going anywhere, and if we withdraw our position, the rest of Europe will be threatened, and if we allow West Berlin to fall, well then communism will just spread throughout Western Europe. So what they come up with is what's known as Operation Vittles. And what we're going to see is amazing airlift, where French, British, and Americans are going to fly supplies into the city of West Berlin. for about 11 months, almost an entire calendar year. So the Berlin Airlift is this massive humanitarian movement to provide the city of West Berlin with everything that it needs to survive. This is amazing that they pulled this off. It's going to last from June of 1948 to May of 1949. About 8,000 tons of supplies a day will be airlifted to the citizens of West Berlin. And again, this solves the problem of the blockade, right? So we are just going to fly over the blockade. If you're going to block the road to Berlin, Mr. Stalin, well, then we're just going to fly over it, which then puts the Russians in the position of, well, what can they do to stop us? If they shoot down our planes, well, that's going to trigger war, and nobody wants that. So there's really nothing they can do. This is going to be awesome with planes landing every 46 seconds. So again, try to wrap your mind around that logistical thing, right? Planes are landing one every minute or so in West Berlin, bringing supplies, materials to the people so they can survive. And a great political cartoon here with Stalin up in the chimney, the bird watcher, as the storks, which usually bring babies, are now bringing life in the form of food and coal and medical equipment. And Stalin can't do anything about it. There's a really cool video I'll link below, and you can go out and learn way more about the Berlin Airlift. It's a really great story. So the blockade fails, right? Stalin and the Soviet Union are now the bad guys. So again, in history, we look at different points of view all the time, but in certain situations, there's kind of a bad guy. We understand why he did the blockade, but at the end of the day, you're preventing women and children and elderly people and people who need support and supplies from getting those things. So the Russians, as the rest of the world sees them, are the bad guys. West Berlin does not fall to the Soviets, so containment works. We're able to maintain West Berlin's integrity. It does not fall to the communists. Eventually, Stalin lifts the blockade. The US, the British, the French are going to unite their sectors formally in 1949, in May of 1949, and create the Federal Republic of Germany, which will eventually become like a West Germany. And this action is going to convince other European nations to join this newly formed organization that we're making called NATO. More on them in a minute. And Berlin as a city will become a huge symbol of the Cold War. From now until basically the end of it, and Berlin will play a very big role in the story of the Cold War. More on them in some future lessons. So, some more examples of containment. So again, how do we keep communism where it is? Well, the United States is going to work to create what's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. It's a military alliance of Western nations, mostly in Western Europe and in the Western Hemisphere, that are going to join together for mutual protection. If one member of NATO is attacked, then all the nations of NATO would go to war, very much like we talked about the alliances in pre-World War I years. So the military alliance isn't to create a third world war or a big nuclear war. It's to prevent communism from spreading, which is, again, our purpose. Containment. We want to keep communism from spreading and invading other nations, and we see that through the formation of NATO. And then eventually in 1955, the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact, which is its own military alliance. And we can see, again, those clear divisions between East versus West. NATO now versus the Warsaw Pact. And again, containment. We're afraid that communism is going to spread. Well, containment is going to take a really, really, really big hit. When 1949, Mao Zedong declares the creation of the People's Republic of China. We're not going to go through the whole history of the Communist Revolution in China. That would be about 8 videos, and this one's already getting super long. But basically what happens is, prior to World War II, there was this uprising in China, the Civil War. World War II, the Japanese show up. They kind of chill with each other, fight back against the Japanese, and then after the war is over, they go back to this revolution, and the communist forces under Mao's leadership take control of China's government, becoming now another communist nation. So big picture, right? Cold War. We are super worried because now there are a billion new communists on the planet. Communism has now spread. Containment has failed. And if communism can spread from the Soviet Union into China, where could it possibly go next? So with now the Soviet Union as a communist nation, as China now a new communist nation, where else might it go? Could it spread to Korea or Southeast Asia or India or the South Pacific? Could it spread to Japan? So this is a big concern of the United States. Where is communism potentially going to go next? And what actions are we going to have to take in order to do that? And again, like I mentioned earlier, by 1949, the Soviet Union now has atomic weapons, and that is going to complicate everything. So we could have potentially maybe taken some aggressive actions against the Russians and the communists, but now that the Soviet Union is also another superpower, well, now things have become even more complicated and dangerous if we do take any aggressive actions. And we'll talk later in a future lesson about the arms race that's going to break out between the Soviet Union and the United States as both sides try to develop even bigger, more powerful nuclear weapons. And to wrap things up, these two communist nations are going to come together and form an alliance. In 1950, we had the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, and we can see Stalin shaking hands with Mao, joining together the communist nation of the Soviet Union with the People's Republic of China. And again, this is exactly what the United States did not want to see. Containment has kind of failed. Communism has spread to China, and it could potentially spread to many other places. So that was a lot, right? But the Cold War is a lot. There's a lot going on in the Cold War, and this is just the beginning of it. So some key takeaways from this lesson. Soviet Union was formed in 1922, becoming the world's first communist nation. During World War II, communism is going to spread from Russia into Eastern European nations as the Russian army establishes pro-Soviet governments. After World War II, Germany, which is sort of the center of the story, is divided into 4 different zones, with the Russians taking the eastern portion of Germany, the French, the British, and the Americans on the western part, also dividing the city of Berlin in half as well. The Iron Curtain, coined by Winston Churchill, describes the divide between a communist Eastern Europe and a democratic Western Europe. The containment policy becomes the driving force of the United States during the early parts of the Cold War to attempt to contain communism where it is. We're going to see examples of that with the Truman Doctrine, as well as with the Marshall Plan. The blockade of Berlin was Stalin's attempt to seize control of that city. We were able to defeat the blockade through the Berlin Airlift, as we spent 11 months sending supplies over to the West Berliners. NATO was formed by the United States and the Warsaw Pact by Russia. And then in 1949, China becomes a communist nation as well and allies itself with the Soviet Union, posing now a big problem for the United States. And the 1949 use of the atomic bomb, the development of atomic technology by the Russians, will lead us down the path of a major arms race, threatening the safety and security of the rest of the world. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I know it was a bit of a long one, but I really do hope that it helps, and I hope that you learned something.